Hi everybody, I'm Girl Rides What, and apparently I seriously offended a fellow YouTuber called CasesAndMaterials by a while ago by refusing to accept a video response he made for one of my very first videos, Feminism and the Disposable Male. I'm going to provide a little context. I made a video condemning feminism for exploiting the traditional gender norm of male disposability and the traditional prioritizing of women's well-being and safety in their advocacy. And he responded with a lengthy and kind of meandering rehash of feminist propaganda, mostly to do with a lot of it was marital rape still being unrecognized as a crime in the UK in the early 90s, along with some details on attrition rates for domestic violence and rape and unreported reports of rape, or whatever you want to call it. And he accused me of painting feminism with a broad brush and claimed that feminism is still necessary. Now, I declined to approve the response because it really wasn't a response to any of the points I had made in that video. My problem with his response wasn't even a disagreement, it was just relevance. He also seemed to associate feminism with equal rights for women, rather than with things like patriarchy theory and those lovely offshoots of patriarchy theory, such as rape culture, systemic gendered violence against women, male oppression of women, including the patriarchal terrorist paradigm of domestic violence. He seems to think that feminists are the same as women's advocates or people who believe in equal rights for women. And he was so offended by me not approving his response that just now he sent me the exact same video again in response to my All Those Dangerous Women Haters video. Only this time he put the initial exchange of messages between us superimposed across the screen. Clearly, I really pissed him off when I deemed his response to be subpar, and to save myself future grief, I've decided to approve this latest one, and to provide a coherent and cogent response to it. First off, I would like to fill you all in on some more of our private message exchange so we can all be unbiased about where we stand. I'm just going to go from where he leaves off on his superimposed messages that he put on his video. If you want to read the initial two, go ahead and have a look at his video. He says, "I have a feminist friend and she does not stand for any of that. I am not going to placate you or give you reasons why you should accept it. It was a well thought out response in relation to your critique and broad brushing of feminism. If that alone does not merit its acceptance as a video response, then I can only regard you as someone who is willing to decry the stances of others, but unwilling to accept criticism. The video was polite and fair, not at all aimed at your destruction, it was aimed at discussion, but if I am too small a user for you to acknowledge, then don't accept it. Just let me know, and I will post it as a response to my feminist friend's video, and I will put up an annotation for the few that do see it, that you refused the response. Also, if I really feel the video merits more attention, I have lots of friends with 10 times as many subs as you do, who might on my request favor this video or a far more methodical and scripted video about you in the future. I would have hoped that you would have the integrity to accept the response and allow others to see it and judge it on its merits, but it seems you do not. As for your thoughts that I am bluffing about having many friends with more subs than you, don't think that. I just don't like imposing on people." Okay, my reply to him. The video was polite and fair. It did not, however, address a whole lot of anything I said in my video. I've rejected other requests from people who've done response videos or sent me previous videos they wanted to use as responses, which seems silly, but whatever, that were pro-MRM and anti-feminist. This isn't about me disagreeing with you. I watched about the first 2/3 of your video. Other than criticisms of my broad brushing, all you talked about was the marital rape thing. If I do accept your video as a response, I'll likely post one explaining how your view even on marital rape is simplistic and one-sided. I have no doubt that as a feminist or a feminism supporter, you have friends with many more subs than I have. I can't help but wonder why you would choose to mention this, or make the veiled threat to make another video about me, or mention publicizing that I refuse to comply with your request, other than to try to intimidate me into doing what you ask. Considering the amount of overt public ad hom hostility I encounter on a daily basis simply for stating my views, I'm not inclined to be convinced by such measures. Again, make a case as to what specifically about your video makes it a relevant response to the main theme of my video, which was neither a condemnation of women's equal rights, nor an attempt to blame feminism for creating male disposability, but simply a calling out of the ways feminist theory and activism manipulates, reinforces, and exploits it. Or make a different video and send it my way. As I said, my issue with your video is one of relevance, not disagreement. His response to me: why should it intimidate you that my videos could potentially draw a lot of views? Would it be intimidating if someone with more subscribers made a video response similar to mine? I cannot see why views should be intimidating. It is only the arguments which are of relevance. Why on earth would those who view my video intimidate you? It is illogical. The 200,000 views you have on that video don't intimidate me at all. And no, I never told you that in order to force you to do anything. It was not a threat. How could it be? I told you that to make you aware that although I am a small user, I am not without a voice, such that you can brush criticism aside by ignoring the video which I directed at you. If you find that intimidating, I suspect that you must have a rather torrid time on this site. So basically what we have here is a young man throwing a very polite tantrum, metaphorically posturing by telling me about his many friends with many more subscribers than I have, who will hear all about how I offended him because he'll make a point of telling them. He will do this because, in his words, I am not without a voice such that you can brush criticism aside by ignoring the video which I directed at you. So I can't ignore him. I'm not allowed to ignore him. It's not within my right to ignore him. I'll be punished if I ignore him. What? All this really boils down to is do what I want, or you'll be sorry. And then, like a child throwing a less polite tantrum, he posts his new version of the same meandering video that still fails to address anything I've ever said in any of my videos, but is basically a criticism of my broad brushing of feminism without ever even addressing the question as to why I should not paint all of feminism with that broad brush, but by giving examples of problems women have. A better argument on this, his part, might have been to actually name and give details and evidence regarding feminists out there who loudly and vehemently defy that kind of broad brushing. But considering such creatures are both exceedingly rare and persona non grata within the greater body of the feminist movement, people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who still wears the badge of feminist, but who is listed among anti-feminists on feminism's Wikipedia page, for instance, I'm really not surprised that he couldn't find any examples of feminists or feminist groups who do not exploit and reinforce male disposability to achieve their ends. So I think I'm going to maybe try to explain to Cases and Materials, if he's still listening, a little bit about why I use that broad brush. I'm going to tell him a couple little stories about feminist advocacy. The first one will be about what seems to be his favorite subject, rape. Now, before we start, I'm going to define my terms so we can all kind of keep track of what we're talking about. What we're talking about when I talk about rape is non-consensual or forced sexual intercourse perpetrated by one person on another. Okay? Clear enough? Cheers went up recently when the FBI decided to redefine rape to be more inclusive of different sorts of sexual predation and different kinds of victims. Feminists claimed it a victory of concerted and determined advocacy, because now all kinds of non-consensual things that couldn't be called rape before could, including penetration either vaginally or anally using fingers or objects, and oral penetration by a penis, no matter how slight. This, they claimed, was a victory for male victims as well, because in the past, rape could only be perpetrated by a man and only perpetrated on a woman. And yay! Drugs and alcohol were now included in the definition, protecting even more victims. Now, while this is a step forward for some male victims of rape, most notably men in prison, 200,000 or so of whom are estimated to be raped each year in the US, most of them repeatedly, it's really not until one turns a critical eye on all the available data on sexual victimization and perpetration that one realizes how this new definition leaves 80% of male rape victims outside of institutions twisting in the wind. Why? Because their perpetrators are female. To make things nice and sparkling clear, a man who inserts the very tip of his finger in a woman's vagina without her consent is now a rapist. A man who forces fellatio on a woman, child, or another man is a rapist. But a woman forcing oral sex or full-blown sexual intercourse on a man or boy is not a rapist. According to the CDC's most recent National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, 40% of the people who perpetrated forced sexual intercourse on another person in the previous year were women. But those women weren't rapists, and the men they victimized were not rape victims. And that might surprise you, since there's been so little research done on sexual aggression in women. Most of it doesn't get discussed in feminist circles. One study published in 2005 found that nearly 10% of women surveyed had admitted to using physical force, verbal coercion, or a man's incapacitated state to get sex from an unwilling man. Another 5.4 admitted to having attempted to do so. That sounds like a lot of women who feel entitled to sex, whether the man involved doesn't want to give it to them or not, doesn't it? And oddly enough, when Denise A. Hines performed in 2005, what was then and likely still is the largest cross-cultural study of predictors of sexual coercion in men and women within heterosexual relationships, which examined subjects from 38 sites worldwide, she found that men were more likely to have been forced into sexual intercourse by their female partners than the other way around. Yeah, you heard me. While rates of verbal coercion were slightly higher for female victims than male ones, men were raped more frequently in their relationships than women were. Oh wait, no they weren't, because a woman can't rape a man with her vagina, you see, which is how it is that all the statistics on rape overwhelmingly show female victims and male perpetrators, which leads us to believe it is a male problem. When you intentionally define rape to exclude female perpetrators and male victims, you're obviously going to find a preponderance of male perpetrators and female victims. Do you see how that works? So let me reiterate Cases and Materials, just so we're clear. A man can now rape a woman without having sexual intercourse with her. But a woman can't rape a man even when she's forcing sexual intercourse on him. It won't be considered rape. And because a woman cannot rape a man, if both parties are drunk, he's the default rapist. Are you following me? So, even with the new improved definition of rape that allows men to actually be victims of rape where they were when they were not ever before, that guy who passed out at a party only to wake up with a stripped Q-tip shoved up his urethra and a woman having sex with him was not raped. In fact, if she was high on PCP when she did it, technically he raped her. And while you are sure to claim that not including what is increasingly being called rape by envelopment in their demands for a new definition was an oversight on the part of feminists, I'd like to draw your attention to the recent brouhaha in Israel over its attempt to include just that in their definition of rape. Feminist groups protested and marched against any such inclusion, claiming that if it was included, a path would open for false accusations, counterclaims of rape by men who had actually raped women. In other words, according to Israeli feminists, only men lie about rape. False accusations of rape are only a problem if men are capable of making them. See how that works? Keep in mind, too, Cases and Materials, that there are underage boys in the U.S. right now paying child support to the adult women who raped them, and they aren't even considered to be victims of rape. In other news, a man in France was sued by his ex-wife a year or so ago for not putting out enough during the marriage. He was ordered to pay her $10,000 in damages for her pain and suffering. So not only is it perfectly fine for a woman to rape her husband in this culture in 2012, not 1992, but if he doesn't let her force him into sex, the legal system will actually make him pay for hurting her feelings. I'd like you to do me a huge favor and do a Google search of mainstream articles where feminists, more than one or two, mind you, and prominent ones, decried that particular legal precedent as giving women license to rape their husbands. I'll come back in about 10 years and check to see if you've found anything. And let's see if we can find some exculpatory evidence in feminism's favor when it comes to domestic violence, shall we? Erin Pizzey opened the world's first domestic violence shelter in the UK in 1971, during the height of the second wave of feminism. Ms. Pizzey, who'd grown up with two abusive parents and who was not a feminist, found that 60 of the first 100 women she sheltered were as violent as, or more violent than, the men they'd left. She determined to turn her efforts to helping male victims as well, but soon found her shelter and calling co-opted by second-wave radicals who subscribed to the patriarchal terrorist paradigm of domestic violence. To these feminists, domestic violence was a microscale reflection of society-wide systemic male oppression of women, and they used it as a supporting evidentiary leg for their unifying theory of Big P patriarchy. Pizzey soon found herself to be persona non grata in her own shelter, and after trying to advocate for male victims and receiving repeated death threats against herself, her children, and her grandchildren for doing so, finally decided to leave the country when those threats culminated in the killing of her family dog. In the early 80s, research was quietly begun into the true nature of domestic violence, which was much as Pizzey had claimed. The majority of it involved two people pounding on each other, with women just as likely or even more likely to abuse their male partners. In fact, many of these studies demonstrated that severe unilateral violence against a non-violent partner was up to twice as likely to be female perpetrated than the other way around. In other words, matriarchal terrorism was twice as common as patriarchal terrorism. This research differed from feminist advocacy research because it employed a novel methodology. 1. It used random community samples instead of self-selecting ones or statistics on report, arrest, and conviction rates. 2. It asked men and women the same questions, while feminist Penn studies tended to ask women only about their victimization and men only about their perpetration. 3. It asked men and women about specific acts rather than whether they were victims of crimes. That is, it asked, have you ever slapped your partner? Or, has your partner ever hit you with an object? And 4. It asked who started it. That is, which partner hit first. When feminists criticized these studies for failing to apply context, that is, failing to consider why women were hitting, which they claimed had to be different from why men were hitting, the studies then included contextualization by asking each partner about why they were hitting and why they believed their partner was hitting. And surprise, surprise, it found that men and women abuse their partners for much the same reason, and that women are just as likely to hit out of a desire to dominate or control or strike fear in a partner as men are. Wow, who knew? Not feminists, because they refused to believe it. They also refused, and still refuse, to believe that female-perpetrated domestic violence is as harmful as male-perpetrated, because men are bigger and stronger. It doesn't seem to matter that for every 40 women injured, at least 25 men are, with comparable rates of severity. To many feminists, men are a tiny minority of domestic violence victims and rarely injured by it, at which point they'll usually give some lip service to the idea that even if they're a tiny minority and aren't as harmed by it, we should still feel bad for them. To date, there are about 300 studies that show a pattern of gender symmetry in intimate partner violence. As an example of the kind of feminist bullshitting that goes on about those studies, one feminist, David Futrell, claimed, without sources, that one thing these studies don't do is provide context. Not only is he outright lying, since they explicitly do provide context, but in saying that, he's implying that feminist advocacy research does provide this context when it usually doesn't. And oddly, the gender symmetrical studies do not provide the source material for data presented to the public on government-run websites and clearinghouses on domestic violence, because feminists control that information too. In Canada, any research paper or report provided to the Minister of Justice or any other minister must first be vetted by the Office of the Minister for the Status of Women. Odd how that works. I hear it works just the same in the US. How about the UK? But I think feminism's culpability in our collective abandonment of male victims is best demonstrated by a little thing called the predominant aggressor policy. In the 1980s, feminist domestic violence advocates proposed a new mandatory arrest policy to counteract the tendency of many women to refuse to press charges against their battering husbands. In California, these policies resulted in a 37% increase in arrests of men and a 446% increase in the arrests of women. This unexpected state of affairs led feminist advocates to conclude that female victims were being arrested instead of their batterers. So what did they do? They devised and developed predominant aggressor policies to get arrest rates back to where they should be. These policies require police to consider relative height, weight, and strength, how distraught each partner is — women are more likely to show distress, don't you know — and current approved models of domestic violence, that is, patriarchal terrorism, before deciding who to arrest. And lo, arrest rates went all the way back to normal. Huzzah! I mean, never mind that sons of battered women as young as 12 are legally denied shelter in state-run domestic violence shelters simply because they're male. Never mind that battered men are routinely turned away without even a hotel voucher when they attempt to seek refuge at a state-run DV shelter, simply because they're male. Never mind that battered men who call domestic violence hotlines are routinely still referred to batterer treatment programs instead of victim services. Never mind that battered men with children face the lovely, lovely option of either staying with their abusers or abandoning their children into the sole care and custody of violent women. Patriarchal terrorism is the blanket theory of domestic violence that simply will not die, despite it being the most rare form of domestic violence out there. And feminist academics, research, and advocates continue even now to deny and suppress the truth about both intimate partner abuse and sexual aggression, despite a mountain of empirically sound research that proves them wrong. And why? Because feminists broke Sherlock Holmes's first rule. They started with the theory, big P patriarchy, and then set out to find the evidence. They cherry-picked enough facts to prove that both rape and domestic violence fit the model of patriarchy and were reflections of the grand unifying theory that informs their entire worldview. Now, as far as I'm concerned, women's rights is women's rights, and a woman's advocate is a woman's advocate. To be a feminist, you have to believe in patriarchy theory and all its ugly, ugly bastard children. Patriarchal terrorism, rape as solely male perpetrated, rape culture, systemic gendered violence against women, male privilege, and female oppression. If you believe in all of that, then you're a feminist, and I'm going to paint you with that broad brush. Thank you very much. I have no problems whatsoever with women's rights and advocacy to help women with their problems. But I do have a great, big, fat, ugly problem with feminism. And frankly, anyone with a functioning brain and a beating heart in their bodies should too. Anyhow, that's all I have to say about that. That's all I have to say to Cases and Materials. I hope that he has plenty more to say about me, but doesn't direct my attention to any of it in the future. And all I can say is, you know, if you're going to throw a tantrum, expect to be called on it. Anyhow, hopefully I will see you all later, except for certain people. And I'll just say goodbye.